The Feudal Future Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future Podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are going to shift our focus to Europe and the political morass that Europe finds itself in. And to help us do that, we've got two wonderful guests. We have Fraser Myers, who is deputy editor of Spike and covers Europe for Spike, and Frank Ferretti, who is executive director of the NCC think tank in Brussels. Gentlemen, welcome. Well, we have so much to talk about. Joel, you want to kick us off?
Sure. Obviously, Europe is going through a kind of turmoil politically, particularly seen in the elections in the Netherlands, in France, in Italy. What is the common thread that's driving these trends in Europe? Maybe you're sitting in the middle of it, Frank. What do you think?
Well, I think it's really summed up by this new Portuguese populist party called Chega, which basically means enough. And I think that what a lot of people are saying, enough is enough. And what's fascinating about the dynamic in Europe is a lot of young people who've traditionally been into identity politics or been into the left, what's called the left, have gradually moved over to the more populist insurgencies. And when you go to any of these rallies or meetings in Holland or Germany or France, you'll see that they are 18, 19, 20-year-olds, a lot of women participating in it.
Wow.
And they're basically saying that they really want a new world. And I think they're extremely worried about their culture becoming no longer respected. They're really worried about economically becoming marginalized. They really hate the Green Deal, the net zero policies, which punish ordinary people by forcing them to buy electric cars and instead of driving diesel or other kind of cars. So you have this mood that I've never seen before in all my life, and I'm old enough to have been a 1960s radical, and I remember that kind of mood of optimism and things are really changing. And when you go to France at the moment, you do feel that there's something similar in the air. And so it's kind of captivating, and it's really nice to see that kind of forward-looking belief that something can happen, that things can change.
Fraser, what's your perspective?
Well, I agree with that very much. And I think if you were to distill it to three issues, I would say those are borders, the green issue, net zero, and finally, questions of EU integration and national sovereignty. It might be hard for international kind of viewers and listeners to understand, but being a member of the European Union really constrains countries' national sovereignty. Governments that you elect are actually there's a lot of things that they can't do because so much is decided in Brussels over people's heads. There's a kind of almost like pseudo-democratic element to Brussels with the European Parliament, but really that's not where the big decisions are made. Those are made behind closed doors. And often on those three issues, there is a kind of consensus, and there's a very cast-iron consensus among the mainstream sort of centrist parties, among the sort of bureaucrats in Brussels. And these populist parties, although many of them are very different, they come from different perspectives, different traditions. What they all have in common is that they are challenging that consensus in some way. And so people feel that these are the best vehicles for them to have a voice. And sometimes, it's not that there are problems with many of these parties. Some of them actually have roots in fascism. I mean, they're not fascist now, but they do have those roots. Some of them take issues to extremes. They have racist elements. But that is not what people are interested in fundamentally. People haven't woken up in Europe, a few weeks ago and decided we're all fascist again now, and we want to
make Europe fascist again.
Just what we need.
In fact, if anything, this is a demand for the public to have a greater say in politics. It's a pro-democracy movement, if anything, rather than an anti-democracy movement.
Well, it strikes me as ironic that, especially as Frank mentioned, being radicalized in the 60s, I think Joel and I were both in that similar camp of being students in the 60s. And
I was in the early 70s. Let me.
it was a time of promoting global citizenry.
Right.
The idea that we're building people that go beyond their national borders, that have sensitivity to the needs of others. Can't we all get along? Right? Can't we all work as one? And that launched into a political movement. And are we seeing the end of that now? Is this the end of that global citizen 60s baby boomer ideal?
I think it is. I think people realize that global citizenship is a very abstract concept that is, in a sense, detached from the experience of any particular community. And I think people are realizing that at the end of the day, citizenship, if it's to mean anything in a democratic sense, must have an organic connection to people that you know, that you trust, that you work with, whose language and culture you share to some extent. And it seems to me that one of the problems that Europe has, and Fraser alluded to that, is that sovereignty, national sovereignty, is really demonized by the European Union oligarchy. They regard national sovereignty as somehow morally inferior to the international institutions that they love. They think that expert-led technocratic social engineering is a much better way of running the world than a democratically accountable government. And one of the things we're seeing is a kind of sense of a yearning for a kind of sense of belonging, which gives meaning to people's life. And that's often dismissed as being somehow nationalistic and maybe xenophobic. But what it really is, in historical terms, is patriotic. And patriotism as a concept does not involve hating other people or being opposed to other people. It simply means that you take seriously your own identity, your own community, and you want to build on that. And at the moment, a lot of Europeans feel very insecure that the world that they've been born into is gradually being taken away from them. And the one thing, when I was in France recently, we went around northern France, a place called Pas de Calais, traveling around in the smaller places. And what you will find in all the different small towns is people saying, I don't recognize my town anymore. It's not something that means something strong to me in the way that in the past. And it's this real concern that one morning they're going to wake up and they're going to live in a different world. I think one thing that should be mentioned, which is very difficult for Americans to understand, is that there's also an issue with Islam. Because what we're seeing in effect is, to some extent, the Islamization of Europe. And I'm saying that not as someone that's anti-Muslim, but I know, for example, in Brussels where I work, we, for example, had somebody elected by an Islam party, and they get people elected as by running as members of a religious or a quasi-religious sort of political party. And a lot of people feel that it's one thing to have friends who are Muslim. It's quite or even have a mosque down the road. It's quite another thing when you have to change your life, when you have to adapt to a culture that is alien to yours, and you have to, for example, dress in accordance with cultural pressures that are alien to you. So Islamization is a huge issue in places like Holland, Belgium, France. It's even in Germany. And that accounts to some extent for the political upheaval that is not taking place. I should also mention that unlike in the past, you now have a new coalition of people who call themselves left-wing and Islamists. I mean, I think that's an unprecedented development when you have, like in France, someone like Mélenchon essentially building a coalition of religious ideologue with people who claim to have some affinity to what's historically been called left-wing politics.
This is one of the issues I find most interesting. My daughter goes to Sarah Lawrence, which is a very liberal, small school in New York and not too far from the city. And, they have events, Gays for Palestine. And my daughter, who's been in Israel quite a bit, she just said, well, how is that possible? So, Fraser, and I think this is also happening in the UK as well. How do they reconcile the reality of the Islamic ideology and how it's practiced in the Middle East, and such things as gay rights, transgender? I mean, my daughter said to a high percentage of the students at Sarah Lawrence are gay. Said, what do you think would happen if we dropped you into Gaza tomorrow? How does that work? I mean, it seems like cognitive dissonance, on steroids.
Yeah. I mean, they just ignore it. They just ignore the contradiction. It just goes completely unaddressed. I mean, we had this weekend we had the Glastonbury Music Festival, biggest music festival in Europe, in the UK, and it takes place in the UK every year. Hundreds of thousands of people go, and it's the crowd is full of Palestinian flags. No one thinking that of the hundreds of people murdered at a music festival in Israel only a few months before. You didn't see any Israeli flags. Loads of the artists, famous bands talking about Palestine. Yet no one making the connection between, actually, an attack on similar people. And it's the same with gay rights or women's rights. In fact, not only do they not think of these kinds of things as contradictory, you'll be told you're racist if you raise questions about it. So if you object to the burqa, for instance, which obviously is oppressive to women, or suggest that maybe there's a problem with perhaps anti-Semitism or homophobia or any of these things, or patriarchal culture within Muslim communities, that will be seen as simply stereotyping, not fair. Even when it becomes clear as day, it's just a taboo subject. So the contradictions are never quite reconciled.
So can I just say one thing, which is maybe there isn't a contradiction, because one of the things that unites the Islamists left with the identity political activists, LGBTQ trans activists, is that the one thing they share is a common hatred for Western culture and Western civilization. And in their eyes, when you actually talk to them, they regard particularly Jewish people as almost the personification of hyper-white supremacy, of being more Western than Western. So from their point of view, that this alliance makes perfect sense, because it's all targeting the enemy they really genuinely cannot bear, which is that of the whole legacy and the whole culture that's linked to that kind of humanist impulse within Western civilization.
So the enough that the Portuguese are talking about, that you started off the conversation with, is the difference between accommodating the needs of people who might be hurting because of their, situation in their homeland, and accommodating them in your culture, versus the domination of that culture by the people that you've accommodated. Is that where we've progressed to? Or progress is kind of a probably unfortunate way to say it, but is that where we've gotten to?
Well, I think there is that kind of sensibility that somehow you've been left out, sort of and isolated and looked down upon, whereas people have come in who've been very different than who you are, and they treat it very differently. Just to give you an example, this happened last month in Germany. There was a very famous case where this young woman was raped by a young Muslim immigrant that came into her town. And she complained that she kind of denounced the immigrant for raping her and everything else. So in the end, she got criticized by the judge for making those kinds of statements. And the judge said, what I really think is a big problem is that this poor immigrant, was not assimilated into society enough, so that he learned about the way we live our lives. So it was almost as if she became the problem, the fact that she reacted to her oppression in that kind of way, rather than the person who they were, this kind of immigrant rapist, who they were insulating from being seen as guilty and in some sense being a criminal and transgressor, that it became a problem of, oh, what a pity that we couldn't assimilate this person better. We couldn't educate that person to be a proper German.
And I think what's really interesting and also like your take on this, Fraser, is it seems like the media has completely missed this. When you said the word enough, I'm old enough to remember when Ronald Reagan ran for governor in the state of California in 1966, and his slogan was "Basta ya," which is enough already. And maybe we're at a basta ya moment where people, where a large part of the population, particularly if it spreads to young people, are just saying, I don't like this direction. I mean, when we were in France last year, my wife's family's from Paris. They were people were very open about this. So are we at some sort of tipping point, or how are the forces aligned? You certainly the mainstream media and the institutions, we have this here too, are clearly on the sort of establishmentarian worldview. Are they going to be able to block this movement, and if you were going to handicap the right and the left, which one you think is in ascendance?
Well, I think certainly the results of the French elections and the European Parliament elections a few weeks before suggest we are at a kind of tipping point,
right,
and that the usual ways of beating back the kind of populist insurgency are not working. I mean, people have been going out in the past week or so when we're recording this in the French establishment, openly calling, the National Rally a kind of a Nazi party, not just hard right, but actually fascistic. I mean, it has fascist roots, but no one seriously believes that it, wants to bring fascism into the country. So the warnings that they used to rely on, the kind of appeals to, don't go there, don't go back to the 1930s are just not working, because A, people can see they're bogus. These parties are not like that. And B, people are so fed up with the sort of centrist mainstream establishment, whether that's the centre left or the centre right. I mean, not only do these parties that are ostensibly democratic parties that you think are supposed to listen to the public and respond to public sentiment, not only do they not listen to the people, they scorn the people. They tell people that they're wrong and fascist and racist for making what are often quite normal demands, like, should we have control of the borders, or if people are worried about the economy not growing, or they're worried about their wages stagnating, or they're worried about too many laws coming in from Brussels. That the climate thing combines all, many of those things, right? Because it's both many of this kind of climate policies come from Brussels. That means that they're decided by someone you didn't vote for, and you can't vote out, and they're incomprehensible, create extreme kind of economic burden, and then you're like, what can you do about it other than to say there's only one? That guy is saying it's wrong, so I'll vote for them. That person is articulating something that I feel.
Well, and add to that the demographic reality that the people who remember fascism in Europe are largely dead. This is, and when you look at it in the United States, I mean, there's a relative handful, right, for instance, of World War II veterans even left.
No, almost none.
So, other than maybe arguably Spain and Spaniards who were around during Franco, the bulk of most people's experience with fascism is generations old, and so that it doesn't seem to be working anymore as a dog whistle that people can respond to.
Yeah, I don't think
I'm not sure about it. I think that the fascism label, the demonizing of these movements as hard right, calling everybody far right, is so deeply entrenched because the media is continually repeating that. So even if people have no idea what fascism was, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if they know what hard right was. Just the very use of these labels now has become so promiscuous that it basically means that, I mean, I spent a lot of my time telling people when I debate them, informing them that contrary to what the guy said, I'm not a fascist. that in fact I spent a lot of my youth fighting fascism, because fascism becomes a label that's attached to you so easily. When the newspapers, time and again, day after day after day, I mean, just look at the newspapers. Everybody who in the old days would have been mainstream conservative or whatever is now hard right. I mean, there's no such thing as even right anymore. It's either far right, extreme right, you get all these different kind of expressions. So the struggle over language, I think, is a huge, huge issue in Europe, in Britain as well. And that's something that people like Fraser in Spike and other people really need to get a grip on, because they are controlling the language. And we're always fighting catch-up. We somehow got to basically have a language war against them to demonstrate that words should really mean something rather than be used in that kind of horrible way.
I wonder if, to some extent, what we're seeing is a transition from this worldview that came out of the establishment media, and with the climate change agenda and all these other things, that maybe we've gotten to a point in which the people no longer listen to their legitimate masters, and maybe part of it is what we're doing right now, which is using the new media to get a contrary message out, and at least as of now, they can't censor it. I mean, are we really? Do you really think that this is also sort of the abandonment of the elite principles and the loss of credibility from the elites? I mean, when you start hearing about how they're going to have to get rid of half of agriculture in the Netherlands, which is the most efficient agricultural producer probably anywhere outside maybe of California. I mean, have we reached a point now where people just aren't listening? And by the way, it's not just the left-wing press. If I read the FT or even the Wall Street Journal, it's more establishment party line than anything that really challenges the establishment. I mean, do you think we've reached a point where enough of the people no longer trust the mainstream media and establishment to revolt in huge numbers?
I think yeah. So there's a French sociologist called Christophe Guilly, and he made a really good point recently. He said that the working class in France, or the majority of people now they're actually just independent almost. They're not part of they're not taking the instructions as intended. They're not. It's the message just from the establishment just isn't reaching them in the same way. And why is that? Whether it's because, as we're talking about, the promiscuous use of language, if everything's far right, then nothing is far right. Is it the lack of trust? Is it the fact that, again, and it's another word that, I'm guilty of using, and I've used it today, is talking about the centre. But the centre, the sort of centrist moderates, if you take a step back and think about it, are completely crazy, right? I mean, they're the people who believe in this net zero stuff, and as you said, Joel, basically willing to destroy, European agriculture at the flick of the pen. They're the people that will tell you that women can have penises, or whatever crazy fad that comes along. They're the ones going on board with it, and yet, in the mainstream media certainly, and we all kind of end up going along with it. We call these people centrist. We call them sort of centre left or centre right, or moderate, and that kind of makes no sense, and it is very hard to push back against that.
Well, you know what, though, to be fair to the nutcases, I believe the media uses these with great intention to be able to draw in readers, to draw in viewers. This is clickbait. This is our modern version of William Randolph Hearst blowing up the Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898 in order to be able to get readers. And so, I guess shame on us for living in a world where our economic system is dependent upon being able to suck in readers on whatever premise possible.
But even more importantly, the media is not what it used to be in Randolph Hearst day. It's the dominant institution in society, because as political parties have declined, and we should talk about that, the way that in Europe political parties have become zombie parties. These are the mainstream parties. The mainstream parties that dominated Europe since Second World War, they barely exist anymore. Even the German Christian Democratic Union, the last one, is gradually unraveling and is losing its members. As that has occurred, the media has acquired an incredibly important political role. So at the moment, elite hegemony relies entirely on the media and being able to provide a script for the different institutions of European society. And if you look at the way that things work, for example, if you look at something like Politico magazine, which is probably the most important European newspaper outlet, they play a very important role in almost prompting different individuals within Europe about what the new script is, what the script for the week is. And it's not, it doesn't come out of the playbook of politicians or political parties. The media plays that kind of a role, which is why I think that the language they use, is so homogeneous. I mean, it's interesting. Every single European society is the same language, the same words. And not only that, but they've simply refused to report important things that contradict their version of events. So, for example, like after the elections in Paris, there were riots, anti-RN riots breaking out all over France, where they were burning down, houses and attacking shops, even in places like Bobigny, which is a Parisian suburb. This was going on, almost like the most anti-democratic flouting of an electoral result. I pick up my newspaper, and there's not a mention of it, not even a hint, not even a 2 column inches about something that is crucially important. That basically you have a significant section of society that's refusing to accept the results of an election. Imagine if they were Trumpians, what a blowback that would be against that within the media.
Yeah, I wonder also, just because I know that you're from Hungary and grew up in a country that was communist. Is this something like the Soviet Union, or is it something? Is it like somebody once called it SoftStalinism?
I think it's stronger than Stalinism, because I remember as a child that we would go home and we would laugh at all the stupid things we heard in schools or in the media. And there used to be all these jokes, and the jokes were about all the different silly things that the Communist Party was promoting. Today it's a little bit different, because in addition to the media, you have cultural institutions that are systematically trying to indoctrinate society, particularly young people. So when young people come home now, and they basically have been told that their nation is worthless, that their history is a history of shame, that there are 120 genders rather than just men and women, and this is something they already pick up at the age of 6, 7, and 8. A lot of parents are at a loss to know what to do. They're not laughing about it. They're not saying, "Look how idiotic it is," about what they get, what's on the school curriculum. Instead, a lot of parents are intimidated, and they basically become paralyzed. And I got so many friends who are telling me that they're losing their children. So you have this kind of problem which never existed in a communist society, even though it was meant to be totalitarian. But it was far less total than what we're seeing today in terms of how the media and the cultural institutions work.
One of the things and maybe Fraser, you're the youngest person on this podcast, so maybe
and the best looking one.
Well, I'm not sure I'd say that, but but
it's all about the hair.
That's right.
I just want to let you know it's all about the hair.
Well, you lost that one. Here's something. I'm trying to understand what's going on with the young people, because they're supposed to be indoctrinated. They're supposed to follow this script, and some of them are. But how is there blowback among younger people? And if that's happening, how is it happening, and what does it mean?
Yeah, there's enormous blowback, particularly among Gen Z, the Zoomers. And you see that in most Western European countries. So National Rally's most popular party for the French Zoomers. second most, or the alternative for Germany, second most popular in Germany among German youth after the sort of centre-right Christian Democratic Union. I think there's an element of, partly it was always just a bit of a stereotype, I think, that young people are all into these sort of left-wing progressive parties and in safe spaces, or it takes a sort of section of kind of middle-class youth and says that that's what all young people are like. Or, you know, in recent years, we had a lot of the sort of Greta Thunberg-inspired climate protests, and, you know, people in the media in particular, people in politics like to say, look, you know, we're on the side of them. That's what the future looks like. So so partly it is more, you know, we're seeing really the shattering of a stereotype. But also I do think that there are many, you know, particularly that younger generation, if they're only just coming out of school, they will have been confronted with, I guess, sort of woke ideology. You know, if they're boys in particular, I mean, it is mostly boys and men, being told that their masculinity is toxic. They've had that sort of shoved down their throats from an earlier age. So you can kind of see that if they were going to rebel against their parents, then this is how they do it, rather than turning to the progressive left, when actually that would get them a gold star from a lot of the sort of adults in the room.
Well, one piece of wisdom from my younger daughter, the one who goes to Sarah Lawrence, is she says, "Don't worry, Dad. We hate the millennials more than we hate the boomers."
Well, that's good. We're going to need them to push the wheelchairs, so I think that's fortunate.
So, just to sort of wrap up, where is this going? I mean, will the European establishment be able to hold this tide back, or are we headed towards a period of just of sort of chaos in our political life? Is that so where is it going? Maybe start with you, Fraser, and then we'll ask Frank for his projection.
Well, yeah, I think that at the moment, you know, we shouldn't say that these parties are not necessarily gaining majorities, but they are sometimes, in some places in Western Europe, they're coming top in some of these elections, sometimes second. I think it's, you know, just don't know. A lot of it depends on how the sort of centre ground reacts, because for certainly the past 10, 20 years, they've tried their best to maintain a kind of cordon sanitaire around these parties, to say, you know, they can't be part of the government. We must exclude them at all costs. Telling voters that, you know, it's okay to vote for the party that's meant to be our rival if it keeps out the horrible hard right populists. And that is one of the things that we can see is crumbling now and not working. We have also seen in some cases, I think Giorgio Maloney in Italy is a good example of this, where actually the populists have been cowed slightly. They've got into government, they've made lots of concessions and accommodations, and to some extent it hasn't really worked. So in Giorgio Maloney's case, you know, she has been courted by the EU. She's often seen as sort of good friends with Ursula von der Leyen, but she was not in the room at all when the EU was carving up the top jobs and deciding who the next EU president or European Commission president should be, and who the next European Council president should be. So I don't know whether she will sort of learn the lesson that you can't necessarily deal with the powers that be, with the Brussels establishment, and still deliver for your voters. So there's that. It depends, how much do the populists stand up for themselves, and how much are the elites able to resist and keep them out with the sort of cordon sanitaire strategy.
So can you give us odds?
Can you give us? Well, look, I think the populists, I can say what I think the voters will do. I think the populists will gain in popularity, because my sense is that the reaction from the establishment is always to try to shut these things down, try to censor them, try to ignore them, not engage with the issues people care about. So I think in terms of how well they would do in elections, I think the sky's the limit, really. The only way is up. But, you know, in this sort of weird kind of post-democratic age we live in, it doesn't necessarily, just because people vote for something doesn't mean it will happen, unfortunately, especially in the EU.
Frank?
Well, I'm 120% behind populists. I don't particularly care what kind of populists they are at the moment, because the more that they move forward, the more things get opened up, and the more that people are able to become part of the conversation. And whenever people become part of the conversation, then I think you can have a greater confidence that some kind of democratic decision-making may take off. But realistically, I would say that at the moment what we're seeing is the implosion of the elite parties. And they've created a space where populist movements can advance. And it's not simply the case that it's an inner drive within populism that has led them forward, but the fact that there's been a vacuum, that people have basically abandoned these old mainstream parties who are retreating all the time. The way that I look at it is that things can happen very fast. I think the situation in France is crucially important, because whatever happens in France, even if the RN doesn't get to be the governing party, even if they just maintain their existing vote, that's a game changer, because it basically means that France, which is one of the mainstays of the European Union along with Germany, has gone rogue as far as their eyes are concerned. And this is something that in Brussels and elsewhere they are watching with trepidation. They know that they cannot simply carry on in the old technocratic way. So what I think is really important is that this has happened. Populism will continue to grow, but it will take a long time, because most parties lack the maturity, the political maturity, and lack the programmatic clarity to know exactly what it is that they want. They have not yet learned how to stand on their 2 feet and to basically become clever maneuverers in politics. So that's going to take a bit of time. But there's two things that I'm very pleased about. One is that the youth are moving in the right direction. And then, as Ferretti was saying, there's a large number of kids that are becoming politicized in the right kind of a way. Of course, it's still polarized, because by and large, university students are still supporting the status quo parties, the status quo movements. But most of the other kids are moving in a slightly different direction. And that's really positive, because that's new. Certainly new in my lifetime to see that kind of genuine youth radicalization occurring, where young working class kids, men and women, girls and boys, and also a lot of black and North African people are taking part in this. It isn't just simply a white kind of phenomenon, are moving in the right direction. I should also put in a plug for my own country, Hungary, because I think what Orban has did, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is by giving 2 fingers to the European Union and calling their bluff. It has basically a situation where a lot of other people are saying that if Hungary can basically give 2 fingers to the oligarchy in Brussels, then maybe we can do as well. And I can see that a lot of other parties, a lot of other movements of different political complexion are all drawing the conclusion that they don't need to be good boys and good girls anymore, that they have the right to stand up and fight for their national interest rather than roll over all the time. So basically, I wish I was Fraser's age. I wish I was maybe a little bit younger, but I would like to get stuck in and do things better than I did in the 1960s, and maybe contribute to developing this movement in a more positive and in a more future-oriented direction.
Well, this growth of national interest, or reemergence of national interest, is obviously something that we're dealing with in the United States as well. And so globally, if we're headed into this resurgence of national interest, rather, is it something that you see as cyclical? Do you see that ultimately there will be some kind of synthesis that comes out of the juxtaposition of national interest versus global commonality that will ultimately result in changing the institutions in Europe and around the world?
I think that that's a big question. And what you really are asking is the form that political realignment will take. And the problem that I have in answering that question is that the existing ideologies have become exhausted. Everything from communism to socialism to liberalism to conservatism, they've become exhausted, and they've lost the capacity to motivate people. And therefore, we're now in a situation where we're going to rethink, what kind of politics we would like to see moving forward. Are we going to get stuck and remain with labels like left and right at a time when their meanings have completely changed and almost have an absurd kind of content? And myself, what I'm looking forward, what I'm hoping is going to occur in this crucial moment that we're heading into, is that people will begin to basically not just simply repeat the ideals of the past, but try to find a way of reappropriating that in such a way that it answers the questions of our time, which are very different than the questions that we had to answer 20, 40, 50 years ago.
Fraser, we're going to give the final thought to you. Is this something that makes you hopeful, or is it something that scares the hell out of you?
After all, he's the one who's going to live in this world.
Right.
Hopeful, definitely, because this is a way of people trying to find their voice in an age where, in an age where so many issues have been taken off the table of democratic debate. There are so many things that, especially in the context of the European Union, but I think it's true of the US as well, ideas, contests about the economy, questions about borders, questions about sovereignty, questions about, the climate is another one. They're just decided by experts, by technocrats, by officials, by judges, and the populist parties are saying, no, we actually we don't agree with this approach, and we want to do something different. And whether you agree with their exact approaches or not, I mean, and all of them have different different views all across Europe and across the world. It doesn't matter. The point is that these ideas and issues are being put up for discussion again. That nothing. The establishment might say that here's the consensus and you have to accept it, and these parties are saying you don't. And that, for me, can only be a positive thing. These parties are not the finished product. They're not necessarily, something that they don't have all the answers, but they, in opening up the debate, in bringing more people into the debate, in getting people excited about politics and political change. I mean, one thing that's worth pointing out is that in every election recently, where turnout has gone up, you see the populist vote go up. So it's clear that people who had felt apathetic, demoralized, depoliticized, are excited again, hopeful again. So I certainly share their hopes.
Well, gentlemen, thank you. It's interesting. I don't know if you're aware of the fact that there's a famous Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. And we are certainly living that now. I want to thank you for being part of the Feudal Future podcast. We look forward to seeing how all of this plays out and to having you back on the podcast. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The Feudal Future.